Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the currently untitled ongoing series where I take a look at how various games handle moral choices so that we can try to learn why some games do it well and why other games do it maybe not so well. And today, I figured I'd go over a game that I was getting recommendations to cover even before I technically started taking recommendations for this series, with that of course being Undertale. Now, Undertale is an interesting game because it was originally sold as, quote, the friendly RPG where nobody has to die, with the game's whole gimmick being that instead of simply fighting and killing all the monsters and random encounters that you come across, you could instead befriend them, spare them, and go on dates and all that good stuff. And at the same time, it also kind of falls into most of the pitfalls that plague bad moral choice systems that I laid out in my first video on this series. Now hold on, before the monolithic Undertale fandom crucifies me for saying that, let me explain, because personally, I think that the people that prop up Undertale like it's the absolute peak of moral choice design in games are kinda missing the point a little bit and underselling some of the more meta themes of the game. Because I honestly think that Undertale having a bad moral choice system is actually done completely on purpose and is part of the game's core themes, which at the end of the day only make the game an overall better experience. So, allow me to explain. Also, obviously, there will be spoilers for Undertale in this video if you haven't played it yet yourself. So in the first video I made on this series, I talked about a bunch of games like Fallout 3 and BioShock and whatnot that I feel represent a number of pitfalls that many bad moral choice systems in games often fall into. Link in the description if you want to watch the whole thing for context, but to summarize, Undertale on the surface basically has many of those same problems. Each choice in Undertale is very black and white. It is quite literally just a matter of killing or sparing literally every character that you come across. On top of that, you're given very little justification for killing anyone beyond, I guess, it being slightly easier and faster, but you're given pretty much no actual moral reasoning for doing so. And on top of that, you're heavily encouraged to go for extremism. The vast majority of the game's unique content is locked behind doing either a pure pacifist run or a pure genocide run. So you stop making individual choices really once you've chosen what path to go down. Not to mention that the genocide run pretty much removes any brevity or ease that you might have gotten from killing the NPCs because you have to mercilessly grind out every single random encounter until there are no monsters left in the area, which ends up taking way longer than the pacifist run in most cases, and your reward for doing so is often way more challenging boss fights. But, like I alluded to earlier, I think that Undertale is a good example of why these pitfalls that I've outlined don't necessarily mean that a game is bad. For example, in my original video, I talked about why I don't like the Paragon and Renegade system in Mass Effect, and while I still stand by that to this day, I do think that Mass Effect is still a great trilogy worth playing, with tons of great writing and characters. So on a similar note, I think that Undertale is a great game despite its bad morality system, but furthermore, I think that I could easily argue that Undertale likely did all of this on purpose to try and make a grander point specifically about these kinds of morality systems and the sorts of players that play with them. After all, throughout Undertale, if you're not actively playing a pacifist run, the game practically begs you to. Both throughout the game and also very explicitly at the end with Flowey's dialogue, where he straight up asks the player to basically play through the game again and try a pacifist run if you didn't manage to do it the first time around. I mean, hell, the way most people's first experience with the game goes is that they usually end up accidentally killing Toriel because they can't figure out how to spare her, and then Flowey pops up immediately afterwards and basically tells the player in a very sarcastic way that you can just reload the game and try to save her instead. And from that point on, most players end up wanting to try and spare everyone that they come across. So right off the bat, the game is basically not so subtly telling you to do a pacifist run. I mean, it even says so on the store page. That's why they phrase it that way. But to reiterate, I think that this is a good thing, because ultimately, I don't think that Undertale is really about the moral choices that it offers. I mean, we can just take a look at the character of Flowey to understand what I mean. When you get deep enough into the game's genocide run, near the end of the game, Flowey essentially gives you his life story, and I think that it's pretty telling as to what the game's real themes are from this. Flowey's backstory is quite literally that they are a stand-in for the player in the game's world before you, the actual player, arrives there. He explicitly had the power of determination, which is essentially the game's ability to save and reload time so that he could go back and change his decisions and interactions with all of the other characters in the game. He talks about how he basically played through the game a ton, trying out different things and different interactions with all of the other characters just to see what would happen. And I mean, this is a pretty relatable situation. I'm sure most everyone has had a game that they have played over and over again just because they love living in that world and they want to explore as much content as they can find. But at some point, you're going to exhaust all of the basic content you can get from playing the way you normally play. There's only so many ways that you can play the hero before the story beats start repeating themselves a few too many times for it to be interesting anymore. Which of course means that the only option left, if you want to keep extracting content from the game, is, well... And I mean, again, who hasn't experienced that themselves as well? Whether it's a game like Mass Effect or Skyrim or whatever, you save the world a few times and eventually you do a playthrough where you choose all the renegade options, or you do something like deciding to turn into a werewolf and seeing if you can manage to kill enough NPCs to physically walk across the entirety of Skyrim without ever leaving your wolf transformation a single time. And yes, that is a very oddly specific example. And of course, the story of Flowey mirrors this pattern of behavior perfectly. He starts out caring for every single other character and trying to help them in a variety of ways, but over time, he exhausted every possible basic interaction that he could think of, until eventually, he just stopped thinking of the characters as anything more than, well, NPCs in a game. Just numbers and sets of choices with different outcomes to be explored. All he cared about was sating his curiosity, and killing these NPCs was just yet another choice to be made to find new interactions to be experienced. There was no malice behind his actions, he simply wanted to see what would happen if he actually went through with killing one of them. They didn't do anything to encourage him to kill, there was no inciting motivation for him to take the quote-unquote evil route. He simply no longer took their lives seriously because he wasn't invested in their well-being anymore. It was all just content to be consumed. And that is the point that I think that Undertale is making. When you do this kind of thing, when you make the evil choice in a game that doesn't really give you any good reason to, you've essentially stopped engaging with the game on a serious level. You're only playing it for the sake of sating your curiosity to see what would happen if you picked all of these evil options, and you've stopped any and all pretense of actually role-playing as your player character. And if you'll forgive me for the tangent, that's a word that I want to talk about for a little bit. Roleplay. I've seen a number of people tossing around this word in the comments of my previous videos in order to justify certain moral choices that I personally think are poorly written or given no real in-game motivation to perform. Some people just say, well, what if I'm role-playing as the kind of evil bastard that would want to blow up a city or commit multiple acts of genocide? And I'm like, I'm not saying that you can't do that, but I have to ask, how many people actually are role-playing when they make these kinds of heinous choices? Roleplay isn't just a word you can toss around to justify any action you can take in a game. When you roleplay, like when you are actually role-playing, you typically are still playing as a character that you've made up. A character that should ideally have their own wants and desires, their own motivations, and of course their own moral compass, even if it is still different from your own. And generally speaking, a well-written character doesn't just wake up one day wanting to be the villain. They usually have some desire or justification that motivates their actions, even if those actions can easily be read as villainous. And it might not be a justification that you agree with as a person, or even that great of one to begin with, but there is still typically at least some thought process behind those actions beyond just being curious as to what would happen. So like I said, when someone commits to an evil playthrough of a game, are they seriously engaging with the game on a deeper level and trying to roleplay as an evil character who would actually have real justifications for taking all of these evil actions? Maybe. But are they just doing the quote-unquote evil playthrough just because they're curious what would happen? That sometimes feels more likely to me. It's not impossible. Maybe you really did come up with a character who has some kind of legitimate personal reasoning for why they would want to wake up and do a genocide first thing in the morning. But I'm willing to bet that, like what Undertale posits, the vast majority of players are likely only doing evil playthroughs in these sorts of games because they're curious to see what happens, and they have stopped actually engaging with the game on any serious level. This is why I don't think that just claiming that you can roleplay necessarily justifies these kinds of badly written moral choices in games. After all, by that reasoning, then no developer should have to provide any kind of motivation or justification for any kind of action that the player can take. Like, why even bother writing a compelling, nuanced scenario where each option has its own legitimate pros and cons and where different players might actually disagree as to which is the better option? Just have the player make up their own motivations and reasons instead. Now sure, if you are able to come up with these kinds of justifications yourself, and that helps you enjoy your games more, then more power to you. But at the end of the day, I think that it is still a problem that should be acknowledged and critiqued as such, and I don't think it should be the responsibility of the viewer or the player to solve these problems with their own headcanon interpretations and motivations. Now I know I got a bit off topic there, but ultimately, this is the kind of conclusion that I arrived at after looking back at Undertale. Now I know I got a bit off topic there for a little while, but ultimately I think that Undertale is trying to reinforce this idea as one of its core themes. Sure, at first it can come off as an entirely player-focused theme, one that critiques the kind of person that treats the NPCs in a game as disposable, but I think that it can also apply to developers for when they're creating these kinds of moral choices in the first place. Looking back at Undertale, the game explicitly gives you no real moral reason to actually do a genocide run. Doing so is pretty obviously and explicitly evil, and everyone in the game calls you out for being so ruthless. And ultimately, the fact that every character can be saved pretty much quells any potential justification that someone could have come up with for having to murder any of them, let alone all of them. So the only real way to do a genocide run is to stop engaging with the game as an interactive narrative that you are taking part in, and to start only thinking of the game as a piece of media that has hidden content that you want to sate your own curiosity with, or to just see if you can pull it off if you already know how difficult some of the genocide bosses are. And to be fair, I'm not personally saying that it's wrong to enjoy games that way. If you have fun doing the genocide run in Undertale, or frankly any other game for that matter, then feel free to keep doing so. But if the player is the one that has to do all of the heavy lifting in coming up with any kind of character that would actually perform these actions in the game, or worse yet, if the only way to possibly justify taking such actions is to just completely disconnect from the game and stop taking it seriously, well then I view that as a fault of the game. So if a game actually wants to present good moral choices to the player, then it should be trying to actually provide legitimately interesting decisions and reasons to pick either choice, instead of just offering these sorts of pointlessly evil options just to have some kind of alternative and then expecting the player to come up with their own reasons for actually picking them. Not to mention that, I would argue that a choice that actually has good motivation for picking it in the game itself often creates more roleplay opportunities than one that doesn't. For instance, and I know I'm probably going to keep bringing this up a lot throughout this series, but the option to blow up Megaton in Fallout 3 is just so pointlessly evil that the only kind of character that you could roleplay that would justify such a choice would essentially have to be a crazy psychopath with no real care for human life. I mean, you're literally condemning the entire town for a hotel room, which I don't think the rest of the game even plays into very well for further role-playing opportunities. Meanwhile, compare that to, say, siding with the goblins in Baldur's Gate 3. It's still pretty obviously a much more selfish and evil option, but at least in that game you're offered a lot more than just some cash and a nice hotel room for siding with them. You're immediately offered a position of authority, and the people they ally with can promise you a lot more power down the line. Plus, some of your companions even approve of that course of action, and if you like those people specifically, then they might incentivize you to go through with it. Plus, there's some specific scenarios that can play out. Like, for instance, if you're playing as a drow elf, well, let's just say that a lot of the characters in the Druid Grove are, apprehensive to receiving your help upon seeing you. Meanwhile, the goblins are a lot more immediately amenable to you on the onset. So, as a result, maybe you want to try and prove them wrong and help out the druids to show that you're a different kind of drow. Or maybe you think that they don't deserve your help because of their prejudice. It's these kinds of interactions that actually provide the player with opportunities to really roleplay in a meaningful way that the game can actually respect and respond to accordingly. Hell, even if you're trying to go for a full-on murder hobo genocide run, the game even provides a justification for doing so through the Dark Urge backstory option that you can pick during character creation. So, needless to say, I think that it's better to provide these kinds of motivations and interactions as jumping off points to encourage more detailed roleplay, as opposed to basically just doing nothing but offering a minimal reward and hoping that the player can come up with a good reason for themselves. Now, obviously, I think that Undertale itself gets a pass in this regard because, well, as I've hopefully demonstrated by now, deconstructing this idea of how players interact with these kinds of choice systems is clearly one of the game's core themes in its meta-narrative. So, Undertale never really needed a nuanced moral choice system to begin with. And in fact, this point only really works if the genocide route really is as pointlessly evil as possible with no real in-game justification. But, as always, I am happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What do you think about Undertale and its meta-narrative in regards to how choice is handled in games and the kinds of players that engage with them? And how often do you actually think about really role-playing as a character in a game? Not to mention that I'm always taking recommendations for what games I should cover next in this series. I'm thinking I want to try out some of the games that I've seen in the comments a few times that I haven't actually played myself just yet, like Pathologic, but that'll probably take some time before I can make a video on it. So maybe first I'll cover something else that I've actually played, like FTL, or maybe go more in depth about Baldur's Gate 3 or something like that. But feel free to leave me your suggestions down below. And while you're there, if you liked what you saw, then make sure to leave me a like and make sure to subscribe if you want to see me make more videos like this one. If you want to really help support the channel, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.